My name is Maya, and I am 29 years old. To the outside world, my family represents the pinnacle of Black excellence in Atlanta. We belong to the right country clubs, attend the right historic church, and sit on the right charity boards. But behind the perfectly manicured facade of my mother, Vivian, and my older sister, Chloe, lies a suffocating culture of conditional love and ruthless social climbing. I was always the family disappointment. While Chloe was the brilliant Spelman College homecoming queen and the pride of our mother and her sorority sisters, I was the quiet girl who preferred writing code in the dark over attending formal cotillions. Tonight was the annual Legacy Gala at a five-star downtown hotel celebrating our family real estate empire. The ballroom was dripping in crystal chandeliers and filled with the city elite. I was seated at a corner table minding my own business when the shadow of my sister and her husband fell over my plate. Chloe looked flawless in a custom silk gown, her hair pressed perfectly straight. Beside her stood Brad, her white husband, who worked as a wealth manager. Brad always carried himself with that specific type of unearned arrogance, as if marrying into a prominent Black family made him some sort of cultural savior. Brad did not even say hello. He just tossed a thick, heavy stack of legal documents right onto my dinner plate. The gold seal of the county court gleamed under the chandelier light. "Sign the voluntary conservatorship, Maya." Chloe said, her voice loud enough to make the neighboring tables turn and stare. She smoothed her dress and looked down at me with absolute disgust. "We are trying to save you. Have you forgotten how you lost your mind 8 years ago? Mom spent thousands of dollars bribing the church elders to keep your little mental breakdown a secret from the community. You are sick, Maya. You are not fit to manage the $3.2 million Grandma left in her trust." I stared at the paperwork, feeling the familiar sting of their cruelty. At 21 years old, I had suffered from severe burnout and exhaustion while trying to juggle my demanding studies and a full-time job. I spent exactly 1 week in a voluntary wellness clinic to rest and recover. To a normal family, that would be a health issue requiring emotional support. To Vivian and Chloe, it was a shameful stain on our legacy that had to be buried and weaponized. They had spent the last 8 years treating me like a fragile, incompetent child, whispering behind my back and telling their high society friends that I was emotionally unstable. They thought I was a low-level data entry clerk, barely scraping by in a cheap apartment. They had no idea that my brief pause in college was the exact moment I started writing the risk analysis algorithms that would eventually build my massive personal fortune. I took a slow, deep breath and picked up my knife. I cut a piece of my steak, chewed it carefully, and swallowed while they stood there expecting me to crumble. "I am not signing anything, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly even. "The trust stays exactly where Grandma put it." Brad let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He leaned on the table. "Listen to me," he whispered. "You do not have a choice. My firm, Apex Financial, is taking over your assets for your own good. Sign the paper. If you fight this, I will call the police and have you placed on a 72-hour involuntary psychiatric hold." Look around this room, Maya. Who do you think they are going to believe? A respected financial executive or the unstable girl with a documented history of mental illness? I looked up at him, watching the smug satisfaction spread across his pale face. He honestly believed his status and his skin color gave him the ultimate upper hand. He turned to a waiter and snapped his fingers. "Bring us a bottle of your vintage Dom Perignon," he ordered, pointing a finger at me. "And put the $2,000 charge on her tab. Let us see how far that pathetic little data entry salary goes tonight." I did not flinch. I did not shed a tear. I reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and sent a text. I waited. Less than 2 minutes later, the restaurant manager rushed over to our table, looking incredibly pale. He held a black leather folio in his trembling hands. "I am so sorry, sir," he said, addressing Brad, "but your corporate card has just been declined." Brad snatched the folio, his face flushing bright red. "That is impossible," he barked. "Run it again." I picked up my napkin and wiped the corners of my mouth before looking Brad dead in the eye. It is not a mistake, Brad, I said, keeping my tone conversational. Your corporate accounts were just frozen globally. You see, my data entry firm just initiated a hostile takeover of Apex Financial this evening. Have fun paying for the champagne. The color had barely drained from Brad's face before my mother moved. She did not glide gracefully across the ballroom as she usually did. Vivian lunged. Her hand shot across the table, her perfectly manicured nails biting deep into my forearm. The facade of the elegant Atlanta matriarch, the woman who chaired charity galas and hosted impeccable garden parties, shattered in an instant. Her grip was startlingly strong, fueled by a panic I had never seen her display in public. "How dare you!" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper that barely contained her fury. "How dare you embarrass Brad in front of all these people?" I looked down at her hand, then up at her face. The meticulously applied makeup could not hide the desperate, ugly terror contorting her features. I gently but firmly pried her fingers off my arm. "I am not embarrassing him, Mother," I said, keeping my voice low. "He embarrassed himself the moment he tried to steal my money." Vivian leaned in closer, her eyes blazing. "Steal your money? Do not be absurd, Maya. He is trying to protect this family. He is the only reason this family is still respected in this town. Do you think these people," she gestured vaguely to the surrounding tables, "would still invite us to their homes if they knew the truth about you? You have been a jealous, sick girl since the day you dropped out of college. I should have locked you in an asylum years ago instead of protecting your reputation." The words hit exactly as she intended them to. For a split second, the confident woman who had just orchestrated a multi-million-dollar corporate takeover faltered. The old wounds ripped open, exposing the terrified 21-year-old girl who had begged for her mother's support and received only shame and secrecy. My own mother was standing in a room full of our peers defending a white man who was actively trying to rob me, simply because he represented the bourgeois respectability she craved. She was willing to sacrifice her black daughter on the altar of societal optics. I looked at Brad, who was still staring at his phone, desperately trying to access his frozen accounts. Then I looked at Chloe, who was watching our mother with a mixture of fear and triumph. And finally I looked back at Vivian. "My reputation," I asked, my voice steadying, "or yours?" Because we both know my exhaustion was never the problem. The problem was that my breakdown did not fit your perfect narrative. Vivian's eyes narrowed, a cruel glint replacing the panic. "You think you are so clever, Maya. You think freezing his accounts proves anything. It just proves you are unstable and acting out. We anticipated this." "You anticipated what I asked," a sudden chill settling in my stomach. "I filed an emergency petition this morning," Vivian said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Before you even walked into this gala, the judge signed off on it an hour ago. Your assets are frozen, Maya. All of them, including whatever shell company you think you are running." I stared at her, trying to process the magnitude of her betrayal. My own mother had preemptively moved against me. On what grounds, I demanded. "Medical grounds." Chloe chimed in, her smug confidence returning. "Mom provided the court with your complete medical history, including the new assessments from Dr. Evans." Dr. Evans. The name sent a shockwave through my system. Dr. Evans was a prominent psychiatrist in Atlanta, known for catering to wealthy families who needed discreet meaning unethical solutions to their problems. I had never met the man. "You forged medical documents." I stated, the reality of the situation crystallizing. "You committed perjury. We provided an expert opinion based on your documented history of instability," Vivian corrected smoothly, adjusting her diamond necklace. "The judge agreed that your sudden erratic financial decisions required immediate intervention. You will have a hearing next week to determine permanent guardianship. Until then, you do not have access to a single dime." I looked around the ballroom. The string quartet was playing a lively waltz. Waiters were circulating with trays of hors d'oeuvres. Everyone was smiling, laughing, completely oblivious to the fact that my family had just legally kidnapped me. They had weaponized the legal system using forged documents and my past vulnerabilities to strip me of my autonomy. My mother was willing to destroy my freedom entirely just to maintain control over my grandmother's trust fund. "You will not get away with this," I said, my voice lacking the power I wanted it to convey. "I will hire the best lawyers in the city." "With what money?" Chloe sneered. "Your accounts are frozen, Maya. You cannot even pay rent, let alone a retainer for a decent law firm. You are completely dependent on us now, just like you always have been." Vivian placed a hand on my shoulder, her grip tight and controlling. "This is for your own good, Maya. You will thank us eventually. Now wipe that scowl off your face and try to act normal for the rest of the evening. We have an image to uphold." She turned and began greeting a passing couple, her smile returning instantly as if she had not just orchestrated the destruction of her own daughter's life. I stood there, the weight of their betrayal pressing down on me. I had underestimated them. I had assumed their arrogance made them sloppy, but they had planned this meticulously. They had used the one thing I could not easily disprove, my past, against me. I needed to get out of there. I needed to regroup and figure out how to counter a legal assault that had already begun before I even knew it was happening. I turned away from the table, leaving them to their fake smiles and hollow victories. But as I walked toward the exit, I realized the nightmare was far from over. My phone buzzed in my clutch. It was a message from my building's concierge. "Miss Maya, there are 3 gentlemen here who say they need to see you immediately. They claim they have medical authorization." The heavy reinforced steel door of my downtown penthouse did not simply open. It was breached. A loud electronic beep echoed through the marble foyer, signaling that someone had used a master override on the building's biometric security system. Brad managed the commercial real estate portfolio for the building owner, a detail I had temporarily pushed aside while dealing with the immediate fallout of the asset freeze. I sat at my mahogany desk, my fingers hovering over my glowing keyboard. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across my living room. I did not flinch when the double doors swung wide open, slamming loudly against the walls. I simply swiveled my leather chair to face the intrusion. Brad marched into my apartment like a conquering general. Close behind him was my mother, Vivian, clutching a designer handbag to her chest like a shield. But they were not alone. Trailing them was a tall, gaunt white man carrying a black leather medical bag, and flanking him were 2 massive orderlies dressed in clinical white scrubs. The men looked less like healthcare professionals and more like nightclub bouncers hired for a highly specialized job. I recognized the gaunt man immediately from the forged court documents my legal team had intercepted the previous night. Dr. Evans. He was a prominent high society psychiatrist who made a very lucrative living making rich people's inconvenient relatives disappear. Families paid him exorbitant cash retainers to lock away rebellious heirs or whistleblowing spouses under the guise of intensive mental health treatment. He was a hired gun with a medical license. Vivian stepped forward. She had dressed for the occasion, wearing a somber black cashmere suit as if she were already attending my funeral. She pressed a lace handkerchief to her dry eyes. "We are doing this because we love you, Maya," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured sorrow. "You are a danger to yourself. You have been completely out of control since the gala. Freezing Brad's accounts, locking yourself in this apartment. We cannot let you destroy your life." I looked at the men standing behind her. "You brought a medical extraction team to my home, Mother?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously flat. Brad stepped in front of her, taking charge. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit, practically vibrating with arrogance. "The judge signed the emergency petition, Maya. Your assets are frozen, and we have temporary medical proxy. Dr. Evans here has reviewed your history. He agrees that your recent hostile behavior indicates a severe manic episode. You require immediate involuntary inpatient treatment." Dr. Evans set his black bag on my glass coffee table. He did not even bother to look me in the eye or ask me a single diagnostic question. He simply unzipped the bag and pulled out a syringe and a small vial of clear liquid. "Miss Wilson," he said in a bored, clinical tone, "we can do this the easy way or the hard way. I strongly suggest you cooperate. The sedatives will help you calm down during transport to my facility." They were going to drug me. They were going to drag me out of my own home unconscious, lock me in a private ward, and use my heavily medicated state as absolute proof to the judge that I was completely incompetent. By the time the actual conservatorship hearing happened next week, I would be restrained to a bed, unable to speak coherently, let alone defend myself in a court of law. It was exactly what Vivian had done to my aunt 10 years ago when she contested my grandfather's will. She had her committed pumped full of lithium and stripped of her inheritance before anyone could ask questions. My mother was looking at me with that same cold, calculating stare she used whenever I misbehaved as a child. When I was 16 and refused to attend Chloe's debutante ball because I was studying for advanced placement exams, Vivian hired private security to physically drag me to the dress fitting. She had always relied on brute force disguised as maternal care. Now she was upgrading to a psychiatric prison. "Do not make this ugly," Maya Vivian warned, dropping the grieving mother act entirely. "The freight elevator is already locked and waiting. No one in the lobby will see a thing. If you fight these men, they will restrain you, and I will personally make sure the judge knows you became violent and attacked us." Brad smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. "Time for your medicine, crazy." He nodded to the two large orderlies. They stepped forward, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. One of them pulled a set of thick fabric restraints from his pocket. The other cracked his knuckles, keeping his eyes locked on my shoulders, ready to pin me to the desk. My heart rate did not elevate. My breathing remained perfectly steady. I had spent 8 years building foolproof contingency plans, specifically because I knew exactly what my family was capable of. I knew the lengths they would go to protect their money and their social image. I was a risk analyst. My entire existence revolved around predicting catastrophic failures and implementing ruthless, immediate countermeasures. I did not run. I did not scream for help. I stayed seated in my chair. "You are trespassing," I stated simply. Brad laughed out loud. "Trespassing? We have a court order, Maya. We have medical authority. You have absolutely nothing." The first orderly reached out, his thick fingers grasping toward my arm. I calmly moved my hand to the sleek electronic control panel embedded in the surface of my desk. I pressed a single glowing red button. Instantly, the massive tinted glass wall behind me transformed. It was not a window. It was a state-of-the-art smart glass array, and it flared to life, illuminating the entire room with the bright glare of dozens of high-definition monitors. The sudden burst of light caused the orderlies to freeze in their tracks. Brad flinched, throwing a hand up to shield his eyes. Vivian gasped, stumbling backward into Dr. Evans. Every single screen displayed a different live feed. The glare from the high-definition displays washed over the room, casting harsh clinical shadows across their terrified faces. The orderlies immediately stepped back, their intimidation tactics crumbling against the sheer scale of the surveillance array surrounding them. There were feeds from the luxury lobby downstairs, the private freight elevator they had just used to bypass the concierge, the underground parking garage, and every exterior angle of my building. But the center screen, a massive 80-inch display mounted directly behind my chair, was not showing a live feed. It was paused on a crystal-clear security recording. I tapped a second key on my control panel. The center screen flared to life, and the audio pumped through the hidden surround sound speakers embedded in my ceiling. The footage was date-stamped from yesterday evening. The location was unmistakably the VIP level of the Apex financial parking structure. The camera angle was perfect, capturing Brad leaning nervously against the hood of his expensive sports car. A moment later, Dr. Evans walked into the frame carrying the exact same black leather medical bag he had resting on my coffee table right now. The audio was crisp, picking up every echoing footstep in the concrete garage. 50,000 now. Another 50 when the judge signs the conservatorship order. Brad's voice echoed through my living room, sounding tinny and desperate on the recording. On the screen, Brad handed over a thick, unmarked manila envelope. Dr. Evans eagerly opened it, thumbing through thick stacks of $100 bills, his gaunt face breaking into a greedy, complicit smile. "Just make sure the medical assessment justifies an immediate involuntary psychiatric hold." Brad continued on the video, his tone completely devoid of any familial concern. "She needs to be heavily sedated before Monday morning." I paused the video right on Dr. Evans's smiling face. The silence in my apartment was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic hum of the climate control system. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my slacks with deliberate precision. I opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, legal-sized document folder. I tossed it onto the glass coffee table, letting it land right next to the threatening syringe and the vial of sedatives. "I'm a risk analyst, Brad," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a finely sharpened blade. "My job is predicting the behavior of desperate people." Vivian stared at the massive screen, her mouth opening and closing in silent horror. Brad looked physically ill. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving him a chalky, sickly gray under the bright monitor lights. He took a staggering step backward, nearly tripping over the edge of my Persian rug. Dr. Evans, however, was looking at the folder I had tossed on the table. The embossed gold seal of the state Supreme Court caught the morning light, gleaming like a warning beacon. "That," I said, gesturing to the heavy folder, "is a preemptive emergency restraining order signed by a Supreme Court justice at 2 o'clock this morning. It nullifies any lower court rulings regarding my medical or financial autonomy pending a full federal investigation. It also specifically names you, Brad, my mother, Vivian, and you, Dr. Evans, as active conspirators in a criminal extortion and kidnapping ring." I walked around the desk, closing the distance between us. The orderlies immediately backed away, their hands raised in a placating gesture. They were hired muscle paid under the table to intimidate a supposedly unstable woman, not to participate in a federally documented high-profile kidnapping. "You brought a syringe into my home." I continued, staring directly into Dr. Evans's panicked eyes. "You conspired to illegally sedate and imprison a completely sane woman for financial gain. The footage playing behind me has already been securely transmitted to the district attorney's office, the state medical board, and the FBI field office downtown." Dr. Evans snatched his black bag off the table so fast he nearly knocked over a decorative vase. The arrogant, bored society doctor was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified man staring down the barrel of a ruined medical career and decades in a federal penitentiary. "I was misled," Dr. Evans stammered, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I was told the patient was an immediate physical threat to herself. I have been entirely deceived by Mr. Blackwood." He did not wait for a response or a dismissal. He turned and bolted for the door, practically shoving Vivian out of the way to escape the room. The two massive orderlies did not hesitate for a single second. They exchanged one wide-eyed look, realized the catastrophic legal jeopardy they were standing in, and sprinted after the doctor. The heavy steel doors slammed shut behind them, leaving the apartment suddenly very quiet, save for the ragged, panicked breathing of my mother and brother-in-law. The balance of power had violently and irrevocably shifted. The predators were now the prey, trapped in my domain, surrounded by the undeniable digital evidence of their own crimes. Brad was trembling. His hands shook so violently he had to stuff them into his suit pockets to hide the tremor. His knees buckled slightly, and he looked around the room as if searching for a hidden exit that did not exist. Vivian clung to his arm, her carefully constructed composure entirely destroyed. She looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. The grand, untouchable matriarch of Atlanta society had been reduced to a cornered criminal in the span of 3 minutes. "You are going to federal prison, Brad," I stated, the reality of his future hanging heavy in the air. "Extortion, bribery of a licensed medical professional, attempted kidnapping, perjury. Apex Financial is gone. Your spotless reputation is gone. Your freedom is completely gone." I turned my icy gaze to my mother. "And you, mother, accessory to all of it. How will the country club committee react when they see your mugshot plastered all over the evening news?" Vivian crumpled onto the edge of the sofa, burying her face in her trembling hands. A strangled, pathetic sob escaped her throat. Brad leaned heavily against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, his eyes wide and vacant. I had won. I had anticipated their ruthless strike, countered it flawlessly, and secured my freedom and my fortune. I reached into my pocket for my phone, ready to call building security to physically drag them out to the curb. Then a slow, sharp clapping sound echoed from the marble foyer. I turned sharply toward the sound. Chloe was standing in the doorway. I had not seen her slip in during the chaos of the fleeing medical team. She was not crying like our mother or trembling on the floor like her husband. She looked perfectly composed, wearing a tailored cream blazer and holding a sleek silver tablet in her manicured hands. A cold, victorious smile played on her lips. "Bravo, Maya," Chloe said, stepping into the center of the living room. "A brilliant performance, truly spectacular." She glanced down at her husband with an expression of mild disgust before turning her full attention back to me. "But you always were too focused on the obvious immediate threats to see the real danger." She tapped the screen of her tablet and my heart seized as I recognized the bright red logo of the offshore banking firm displayed on it. The bright red logo of the offshore banking firm pulsed on Chloe's tablet screen. It was the exact holding company my grandmother had used to establish the initial trust parameters. Chloe saw my eyes lock onto it and let out a sharp laugh. She tossed the expensive tablet onto the plush cushions of the sofa, where our mother was still weeping quietly into her hands. The banking logo was just a prop, a visual distraction meant to catch me off guard. Chloe reached into the pocket of her blazer and produced the real weapon. She held up a small, sleek silver flash drive, dangling it by a black lanyard from her index finger. It caught the light of the security monitors still glowing behind me. "You think a restraining order changes the reality of how this city works?" Maya Chloe asked, stepping carefully over Brad's outstretched legs as he continued to cower on the floor. "You think freezing Brad's corporate accounts or waving a piece of paper from a judge suddenly makes you untouchable? You are completely delusional. We live in Atlanta. We live in a society built entirely on optics, relationships, and reputation. You can have all the legal leverage in the world, but if nobody will sit at a table with you, your money is completely useless." I kept my hands resting lightly on the surface of my desk. I did not speak. I simply watched my sister. She was pacing the floor now, fueled by the toxic energy of her own perceived superiority. "Do you know what is on this drive?" Chloe taunted, swinging the small piece of metal back and forth. "It is a masterpiece. I spent the last 3 months working with a very discreet, very expensive digital editor. We took the security footage from the clinic you stayed in when you were 21. We compiled the videos of your panic attacks, your absolute lowest moments, the times you were screaming and crying in the hallways. Then we enhanced them. We added a little audio spliced in some erratic behavior from other patients and polished it into a highly convincing documentary of a woman who is completely detached from reality." My heart beat a steady, controlled rhythm against my ribs. I refused to give her the satisfaction of a visible reaction. The cruelty of my own sister harvesting the most painful, vulnerable moments of my life and weaponizing them was staggering, but it was not surprising. Chloe had always viewed my existence as a threat to her position as the golden child. "I have a mailing list ready to go." Chloe continued, her voice rising with manic excitement. "It includes the board of directors of every major financial institution in the Southeast. It includes the senior partners at your previous data entry firm, the investors you secured for your little hostile takeover, and the editors of every business journal from here to Charlotte. All it takes is one press of a button, and this video goes to all of them simultaneously." She stopped pacing and walked directly up to my desk, leaning over the glass surface. Her perfect pageant-winning smile twisted into an ugly snarl. "You think you are smart?" Chloe hissed, her face inches from mine. "I will make sure no one in this city ever hires you to scrub toilets, let alone touch a computer. You will be a pariah. A walking liability. No bank will hold your money, no firm will take your calls, and no landlord will rent to you. You will be exactly what Mom always said: you were, a broken, useless embarrassment." The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the toxic history of our childhood. She wanted me to beg. She wanted me to lunge across the desk and try to wrestle the flash drive from her hands. She wanted me to validate her power by showing fear. But as a risk analyst, I knew that engaging with a volatile threat only escalates the variables. When an opponent shows you their hand, you do not interrupt them. You let them play their cards and you memorize their strategy. I simply stared at her. I kept my face an impenetrable mask of calm analysis, I looked at her the way I would look at a fluctuating market trend, cold, detached, and entirely unimpressed. My silence stretched out thick and suffocating. I watched the triumphant smile on her face slowly begin to waver at the edges. She had delivered her ultimate threat, and I had offered absolutely nothing in return. Fine, Chloe spat, standing up straight and adjusting her blazer. Be stubborn, but you have until Monday morning to withdraw your restraining order and sign the conservatorship papers over to Brad. If you do not, I hit send and your life is officially over. She turned on her heel and marched over to our mother. She grabbed Vivian by the arm, hauling her up from the sofa with surprising force. Get up, Mom, Chloe snapped. We are leaving. She kicked Brad firmly in the side of his expensive Italian leather shoe. Get up, you pathetic idiot. We have what we need. She is trapped. Brad scrambled to his feet, avoiding my gaze entirely as he practically sprinted toward the foyer. Vivian stumbled after him, her face streaked with ruined makeup, leaning heavily on Chloe's arm. The heavy steel doors of my penthouse slammed shut behind them, the automatic locks engaging with a heavy metallic thud. I remained in my chair for a long time, listening to the profound silence of my empty apartment. I did not panic. I calmly reached out and turned off the wall of security monitors. The room plunged back into the warm, natural light of the morning sun. Chloe thought she had won. She truly believed that social blackmail was the ultimate trump card. She failed to realize that I had already built an offshore firewall around my professional identity, completely insulating me from local smear campaigns. Her flash drive was nothing but a nuisance. I spent the rest of the day fortifying my position. I contacted my chief operating officer to expedite the liquidation of Apex Financial's remaining viable assets. I secured my physical perimeter and reviewed the corporate bylaws of my holding companies. By the time the sun set over the Atlanta skyline, casting the city in deep purples and bruised oranges, I was firmly in control. Then at exactly midnight, my secure laptop chimed with a high-priority notification. It was an encrypted email from my lead estate attorney. The subject line consisted of a single alarming word. I opened the message, my eyes scanning the dense legal jargon. My family's lawyer, a ruthless bulldog named Richard Sterling, had not been idle while Chloe was delivering her theatrical threats. Sterling had bypassed the standard family court protocols entirely. He had dug into the state's judicial archives and utilized an archaic, obscure legal loophole from the 19th century known as a writ of familial preservation. It was a defunct piece of legislation originally designed to prevent heirs from squandering plantation wealth, and Sterling had somehow convinced a sympathetic old guard judge to apply it to modern trust law. The writ completely circumvented my Supreme Court restraining order. The final line of the email hit me with the force of a physical blow. The $3.2 million trust my grandmother had left me was entirely frozen, suspended in legal limbo until a full tribunal could be convened. I read the encrypted email 3 times, the cold light of the screen illuminating the dark reality of my situation. The words remained unchanged. My grandfather's legacy, the very foundation of my independence, was suddenly locked behind a velvet rope woven by Richard Sterling, the family's notoriously ruthless attorney. I dialed my lead counsel, Marcus, immediately. He picked up on the first ring, his voice heavy with the exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 4 hours fighting a ghost in the judicial system. The writ of familial preservation was an archaic nightmare. Marcus explained that Sterling had framed my recent hostile takeover of Apex Financial not as a shrewd, calculated business maneuver, but as a manic, destructive episode directed unlawfully at my own kin. But corporate aggression alone was never enough to freeze a multi-million-dollar trust. Sterling needed a medical precedent to validate the writ to a judge. He found it in my past. Because I had voluntarily checked myself into that wellness clinic for exhaustion when I was 21, the legal landscape had entirely shifted. In the eyes of this antiquated court order, I was not a competent adult defending her assets against extortion. I was a previously institutionalized woman exhibiting erratic, vengeful behavior. The burden of proof is entirely on us now, Marcus explained over the phone, the frustration evident in his strained tone. We have to prove your sanity to a judge who has already signed a preemptive order based on your medical history. They weaponized your willingness to seek help 10 years ago. You are guilty of incompetence until proven healthy. While Marcus and his legal team scrambled through the night to draft emergency countermotions, Vivian and Chloe launched their own devastating offensive. They did not attack me directly or aggressively. They were far too calculating for that blunt approach. Instead, they weaponized pity. By Tuesday morning, my social feeds and industry networks were flooded with the results of their carefully orchestrated public relations tour. They attended charity luncheons, country club tennis matches, and high society galas, playing the roles of heartbroken, devoted family members to absolute perfection. Chloe posted a tearful video on her social media platform, sitting in her meticulously decorated living room, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "We are just so incredibly worried about Maya," she told her thousands of followers, her voice breaking with practiced precision. "Mental illness is a devastating disease that tears families apart. We are doing everything in our power to get her the help she desperately needs, even when she fights us. We just want our sister and daughter back safe and sound." The narrative took root instantly across Atlanta. Vivian was photographed having coffee with the wives of prominent judges and investment bankers, looking exhausted and noble, playing the tragic matriarch bearing an impossible burden. The high society elite, always hungry for a scandal wrapped in tragedy, devoured the story whole. I was no longer the brilliant risk analyst who had built a quiet fortune from the ground up. I was the tragic, broken girl from a respectable family, prone to manic episodes and dangerous financial delusions. They were painting me as a wealthy lunatic who needed to be saved from herself. My business contacts began to ice over. 2 potential venture capital investors for my next tech acquisition suddenly stopped returning my calls. Chloe's threat was manifesting not through doctored videos, but through the insidious, polite whispers of the Southern elite. On Wednesday afternoon, Marcus arrived at my penthouse. He looked grim, dropping a thick stack of legal briefs onto my mahogany dining table. "The judge is old school," Maya Marcus said, pacing the length of my living room. "He plays golf with Sterling at the country club. He attends your mother's charity galas. He has already bought into the narrative that you are having a mental breakdown. We can fight the writ, but it will take months. We will have to endure psychological evaluations, public court hearings, and character witnesses. It will be a media circus. They will drag every detail of your life, your business, and that clinic stay into the public record for everyone to consume." Marcus stopped pacing and looked at me, his expression softening into genuine, weary concern. "Sterling reached out an hour ago," Marcus said quietly, bracing for my reaction. "They are offering a settlement. If you relinquish control of the Apex financial assets and agree to a joint management structure for your grandmother's trust, they will drop the writ immediately. They will publicly state that your treatment has been successful and the family is healing. It saves your reputation. It saves your companies from being dragged through a lengthy, humiliating legal battle. I strongly advise you to consider it. They have the social capital, and right now they hold the court." I looked at the thick stack of legal documents scattered across my table. I thought about my mother's fake tears for the cameras, Chloe's smug superiority in my foyer, and Brad's pathetic grasping greed. They expected me to fold. They expected the weight of public opinion and legal bureaucracy to crush my spirit, just like it had crushed me when I was 21. They were relying on my desire for privacy and professional respect to force my total surrender. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city that my family believed they owned. "I will not settle," I said, my voice as cold and unyielding as the glass against my fingertips. "I will not give them a single dime, and I will not allow them to manage 1 second of my life." Marcus sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Maya, the burden of proof is on us. If we go to court and lose, they get permanent conservatorship. You lose your freedom and everything you have built." "We are not going to lose," I replied, turning back to face him with absolute certainty. "Because we are not going to fight them on their terms. They want to make this about my mental health. We are going to make it about their financial survival." I walked back to my desk and activated my secure terminal. I pulled up the initial data streams from the aggressive Apex financial audit I had initiated during the gala. I looked at Marcus, my mind shifting from defense to pure calculated offense. I want your team to stop working on the writ. I want every junior lawyer and forensic accountant. You have to dig into Brad's firm right now. Apex Financial manages the retirement funds for half the judges and politicians in this city, including the judge who signed that ridiculous writ. I want to know exactly where every dollar has gone for the past 5 years. They think social blackmail is power. I am going to show them what real leverage looks like. Find me the rot in Brad's company, Marcus. I am preparing a financial nuke, and when I drop it, there will be nothing left of their precious reputation. The following 14 days were a grueling exercise in tactical restraint. I directed my team of forensic accountants to tear through the digital footprint of Apex Financial. They worked in 12-hour shifts, operating out of a secure conference room in Marcus's firm, tracing routing numbers, dummy corporations, and offshore wire transfers. The deeper they dug into Brad's client portfolios, the more putrid the foundation of his company appeared. They uncovered a sprawling labyrinth of phantom accounts, bloated administrative fees, and the highly illegal commingling of elite client funds. We were not just looking for a simple clerical discrepancy. We were hunting for the systemic, unrecoverable fraud that would burn his entire existence to ash. While my team operated in absolute secrecy, Vivian and Chloe waged their war in the blinding sunlight. They saturated the elite social circuits of Atlanta with their tragic performance. They attended charity galas, museum board meetings, and high-profile country club luncheons wearing matching expressions of exhausted martyrdom. They gave tearful, off-the-record interviews to society bloggers and whispered to judges' wives about my sudden, tragic descent into paranoia. They ensured that every time my name was spoken among the city's power brokers, it was followed by a solemn shake of the head and a murmured prayer for my recovery. Their goal was simple. They wanted to poison the well before I could even draw water. By the time the court mandated a mediation session prior to setting a formal trial date, the local establishment had already convicted me in the court of public opinion. The mediation took place on neutral ground, occupying a sprawling glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of a downtown legal high-rise. The heavy mahogany table dominating the center of the room felt less like a space for compromise and more like an execution block. Marcus sat to my right, his posture rigid, his hands resting on his leather briefcase. I sat perfectly still, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, immaculate bun. I placed a blank legal pad and a silver fountain pen on the table in front of me. I brought nothing else. They arrived 20 minutes late, a deliberate power play designed to establish dominance. Chloe and Vivian entered first, linking arms, projecting an aura of weary, aristocratic sorrow. Brad trailed behind them, wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than my first car. He exuded the casual, unearned arrogance of a man who believed the entire city operated for his convenience. He did not look like a man facing a federal kidnapping investigation. He looked like a man who had already won. The mediator, a retired appellate judge named Harrison, took his seat at the head of the table. He possessed the tired, cynical eyes of a man who had spent decades watching wealthy families tear each other apart over money. He recited the standard required disclaimers about good faith negotiations, the pursuit of a mutually beneficial resolution, and the desire to avoid a public humiliating trial. Brad did not even pretend to listen to the judge's preamble. He slouched heavily into his ergonomic chair, spreading his legs wide in a brazen display of territorial dominance. He draped one arm casually over the backrest of his chair and stared at me with a mixture of profound pity and utter disgust, projecting the aggressive privilege that had shielded him from consequences his entire life. When Judge Harrison finally opened the floor for initial statements, Brad held up a hand, physically silencing his own high-priced attorney. "Let us bypass the legal posturing, Your Honor," Brad said, his voice dripping with casual condescension. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, presenting the image of a reasonable, heavily burdened patriarch forced to deal with an unruly child. "Look, she's a broken black woman from a traumatic background. She has no concept of wealth management. I manage millions. I'm just trying to protect my wife's family legacy. Brad sighed, shaking his head as if the mere sight of me was physically exhausting. We are dealing with severe emotional exhaustion, paranoid ideation, and dangerous financial delusions. My firm, Apex Financial, is uniquely equipped to manage her grandmother's trust and ensure her medical needs are permanently safely funded. We are offering her a lifeline here, not a punishment. She needs institutional help, and we are willing to provide it quietly to save her the public embarrassment. Vivian dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief, nodding in solemn, tragic agreement. Chloe offered a tight, sympathetic smile to the mediator, playing the role of the loving, distressed sister flawlessly. They were waiting for the explosion. The sheer audacity of his words reducing my entire existence, my hard-won success, and my grandfather's legacy to the ravings of a broken woman was designed to trigger an emotional collapse. They desperately wanted me to slam my fists on the mahogany table, to shout about my sanity, to hurl accusations, and to exhibit the exact, erratic, unstable behavior their carefully crafted narrative promised. They needed me to look crazy in front of the mediator. Instead, I slowly uncapped my silver fountain pen. The metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet room. I looked down at my legal pad, ignoring their expectant stares, and wrote a single meticulous line of text. I let the heavy silence stretch out, pulling the tension tight until it hummed in the recycled air of the conference room. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, turning his expectant gaze toward me. He was waiting for my defense, a furious rebuttal regarding my mental competence and my right to govern my own life. I did not offer one. I did not look at my mother. I did not spare a single glance for my sister. I kept my eyes locked entirely, unblinkingly on Brad. I reached into the interior pocket of my charcoal blazer. My fingers brushed against the crisp edge of a folded document. I pulled it out, keeping the printed side facing down. I placed it flat on the polished mahogany surface. Applying firm, even pressure with my fingertips, I slid the single sheet of paper directly across the long table. It glided silently, coming to a dead stop exactly 1 inch away from Brad's crossed arms. It was a bank statement, heavily redacted with thick black ink, showing the destination of a single, undeniable offshore wire transfer. Brad stared at the paper. For a fraction of a second, his arrogant posture held. Then his eyes locked onto the 14-digit routing number barely visible beneath the heavy black redaction blocks. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. The smug patrician sneer vanished, replaced by a hollow, breathless terror. He recoiled from the table as if the single sheet of paper had suddenly caught fire. Judge Harrison frowned, adjusting his reading glasses. "Miss Wilson, the court requires context. What exactly are you presenting to this mediation?" I kept my voice perfectly level, devoid of the hysterical emotion my family so desperately needed me to display. "I am presenting motive, Your Honor." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the mahogany table. "You do not manage millions, Brad. You lose them." Brad opened his mouth to speak, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. His high-priced attorney, sensing a catastrophic shift in the room, immediately placed a hand on Brad's arm. "Your Honor, we object to this line of inquiry. My client's financial portfolio has absolutely no bearing on Miss Wilson's psychiatric competence." "It has everything to do with it," I countered smoothly, never breaking eye contact with my brother-in-law. "Because Brad is not trying to protect my grandmother's legacy. He is trying to steal it to keep himself out of a federal penitentiary." Vivian gasped, a sharp, ragged sound that echoed in the cavernous room. Chloe's head snapped toward her husband, her flawless facade fracturing for the very first time. "That is an outrageous, defamatory accusation," Brad's lawyer barked, half rising from his chair. "I strongly advise you to watch your next words, Miss Wilson." "My words are backed by forensic accounting," I replied, gesturing to the paper. "Over the past 18 months, Brad has systematically siphoned exactly $2 million from his firm's elite client trust accounts. He did not put it into conservative bonds or diversified mutual funds. He panicked. He dumped the stolen capital into a series of highly leveraged, unregulated cryptocurrency shell companies operating out of the Cayman Islands. companies that completely collapsed 3 weeks ago. The silence in the mediation room was absolute. Even the ambient hum of the air conditioning seemed to vanish. Judge Harrison stared at Brad, his judicial neutrality replaced by sharp, piercing scrutiny. Brad was sweating profusely now. Dark patches bloomed under the arms of his bespoke suit. He looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the floor to drop. "That routing number," I continued, my voice echoing off the glass walls, "belongs to the primary holding account of one of those defunct crypto exchanges. It perfectly matches a wire transfer initiated from Apex Financial's Master Client Fund, a fund that Brad directly controls, a fund that currently belongs to a retired federal judge, 2 state senators, and the police commissioner." "Shut up!" Brad choked out his voice, a frantic, reedy whisper. "You do not know what you are talking about. You are crazy. She is crazy." He looked wildly at the mediator, then at his own lawyer. "Tell them she is delusional. She is making this up. My legal team spent the last 2 weeks tearing through your digital footprint," I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "We did not just find the missing $2 million. We found the internal audit your compliance officer initiated 4 days ago. We found the frantic deleted emails you sent to your offshore brokers begging for a liquidity bridge. The Securities and Exchange Commission is already preparing a federal indictment. They know the money is gone, Brad, and they know you took it." Vivian let out a strangled cry. She pressed both hands to her mouth, staring at her golden son-in-law with undisguised horror. The immaculate reputation she had spent decades cultivating was suddenly tied to a massive impending federal financial scandal. The reality of the situation was finally penetrating her thick armor of denial. She realized that Brad's impending arrest would not just be a brief local news segment. It would be a sprawling national spectacle. Her friends, her peers, and her rivals would all feast on the details of her family's catastrophic disgrace. "This is why you hired those thugs to drag me out of my apartment," I said, my voice hardening into ice. "This is why you bribed a corrupt doctor to falsify a psychiatric hold. This is why you used an archaic legal loophole to freeze my grandmother's trust. You do not care about my mental health. You care about my $3.2 million. If you had successfully declared me incompetent, the court would have appointed you as my financial guardian. You would have had instant, unfettered access to my inheritance. You planned to quietly siphon off the $2 million you needed, replace your client's missing funds, and leave me rotting in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my life, while you played the benevolent, grieving brother-in-law." Brad's attorney slowly pulled his hands away from his client, physically distancing himself from the toxic fallout. A lawyer can defend many things, but an undeniable federally documented paper trail of grand larceny against high-profile government officials was career suicide. He closed his legal pad with a definitive snapping sound. He recognized a sinking ship when he saw one, and he had no intention of drowning with a client who had lied to him about federal fraud. "Your Honor!" Marcus spoke up, for the first time, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "We will be submitting the full forensic accounting report to the court by close of business today. We will also be filing a formal motion for sanctions against opposing counsel for utilizing the court's time to facilitate an active extortion scheme." Judge Harrison took a slow, deep breath, his eyes locked on Brad. The mediator was furious. He had been used as an unwitting pawn in a desperate financial cover-up. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge said, his voice dangerously soft, "I strongly suggest you and your counsel prepare a very compelling defense. Because if Miss Wilson's allegations hold even a fraction of truth, I will personally ensure this mediation transcript is handed directly to the federal prosecutor." Brad was hyperventilating. He clawed at the knot of his silk tie, suddenly unable to breathe. He looked entirely broken, stripped of his privilege, his wealth, and his arrogant immunity. He was just a terrified thief who had run out of places to hide. Vivian was shaking her head back and forth, completely unable to process the destruction of her perfect societal narrative. She looked at Brad as if he were a stranger, a monster who had infected her pristine family. She had enabled my abuse for years simply to protect the illusion of her flawless life. And now the architect of that illusion was headed for a concrete cell. The physical threat of the psychiatric hold was dead. The legal threat of the conservatorship was entirely dead. I had taken his greatest weapon, his reputation, and turned it into the very anchor that would drag him to the bottom of the ocean. I watched Brad turn ghost white, his chest heaving as he stared at the single sheet of paper that had ended his life. I watched Vivian gasp, her manicured hands trembling violently as she looked at the man she had proudly chosen over her own daughter. But my work in this room was not yet complete. The financial hemorrhage had only just begun. I slowly turned my head, pulling my icy gaze away from the ruined man. I shifted my eyes across the long mahogany table past the shocked mediator, past my weeping mother, until they locked directly onto my sister. Chloe. Chloe straightened her posture, instinctively attempting to physically distance herself from her husband. She smoothed the lapels of her cream blazer, her face morphing into a mask of betrayed shock. She was a master of the pivot, always ready to throw anyone to the wolves to save herself. I had absolutely no idea, Chloe stated, her voice quivering with manufactured outrage. She looked directly at Judge Harrison, playing the devastated, unsuspecting wife to absolute perfection. Your Honor, I am just as much a victim of this man's deceit as those clients. He lied to me. He kept me entirely in the dark about our finances. If I had known he was engaged in fraud, I would have reported him myself. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound cut through the heavy, stagnant air of the conference room, startling the mediator and causing my mother to flinch. You were never in the dark, Chloe, I said, leaning forward and resting my hands on the mahogany table. You were holding the flashlight. I reached into my leather portfolio and withdrew a second document folder. This one was bound in a bright red clip. I slid it across the table with the same measured precision as the first. It glided over the polished wood and came to rest directly in front of my sister. She stared at it as if it were a venomous snake, refusing to touch the thick stack of papers inside. You see, Your Honor. I addressed the mediator, though my eyes remained locked on my sister. My forensic accountants did not stop at Brad's firm. When you track a $2 million deficit in a household, you have to look at the domestic burn rate. Chloe is the president of the regional alumni chapter of her elite sorority. She sits on the executive board of the Atlanta Heritage Foundation. She is the very picture of curated perfection and Black excellence in this city. But maintaining that flawless high society image is incredibly expensive. Chloe swallowed convulsively, her throat working against a sudden dryness. The color was rapidly draining from her face, matching the sickly pallor of her husband. When Brad's legitimate income dried up because he was desperately plugging holes in his offshore crypto disaster, I explained, my voice steady and unforgiving. Chloe refused to downgrade her lifestyle. She refused to cancel the lavish charity galas, the designer wardrobe updates, or the exorbitant monthly country club dues. They could not afford to look poor. In their world, losing status is worse than losing money. So Chloe found her own hidden revenue stream. I tapped the top of the red folder. You are the primary treasurer for the Grace Cathedral Youth Scholarship Fund, Chloe. A fund built entirely on the diligent donations of working-class families in our community, people trying to scrape together enough money to send their kids to college. Vivian let out another sharp gasp, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned stark white. Maya, stop! Vivian pleaded, her voice cracking with mounting terror. Whatever this is, we can handle it privately. Do not do this here. I ignored my mother entirely. The time for privacy ended the moment they sent hired thugs to my apartment with a syringe. Inside that folder are comprehensive wire transfer logs, authenticated bank statements, and a mountain of falsified invoice receipts. I continued, speaking loudly enough to drown out Vivian's sobbing. Over the past 9 months, Chloe has methodically embezzled $400,000 from the church scholarship fund. That is a lie, Chloe spat, though her voice lacked its usual commanding sting. Her hands were gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly they trembled. I hired legitimate vendors for the charity events. Everything is properly accounted for. You are fabricating this. You hired dummy limited liability companies registered to a ghost agent in Delaware. I countered, immediately dismantling her defense with brutal efficiency. Companies that funnel directly back into your personal checking account. You literally stole from the collection plate to pay for your European vacations and your custom kitchen remodel. You robbed vulnerable teenagers of their college tuition so you could keep playing the wealthy socialite. The impeccable facade shattered completely. Chloe's face flushed a deep mottled red. Her breathing became shallow and rapid. She looked frantically at Brad, but he was still staring blankly at the floor, utterly destroyed by his own exposure and incapable of defending her. She looked at our mother, seeking the blind, enabling support she had enjoyed her entire life. But Vivian pulled away. She physically recoiled from her golden child. Stealing from elite faceless investors was a white-collar crime that Vivian might have eventually rationalized. Stealing from the church from a community scholarship fund was a moral rot that Vivian could not comprehend or excuse. It was the ultimate social death. "You arrogant, vindictive wretch!" Chloe hissed, her voice dropping into a guttural growl as she glared at me. "You hacked my private accounts. That is a federal crime. You are going to jail for this." Forensic accounting is completely legal when investigating the financial motives behind a hostile conservatorship attempt. Marcus interjected smoothly, leaning back in his chair with a look of supreme professional satisfaction. "Everything in that folder was obtained through a lawful defensive discovery process triggered by your own legal filings." Judge Harrison took off his reading glasses and dropped them onto the table with a sharp clatter. He looked thoroughly disgusted. He had been brought in to mediate a tragic family dispute regarding mental health. Instead, he was presiding over a criminal syndicate masquerading as a respectable high society family. "Mrs. Blackwood," the judge said, his tone dripping with absolute judicial contempt, "I strongly advise you to remain silent. Anything further you say in this room will be severely detrimental to your inevitable criminal defense. This mediation is officially terminated." I stood up, buttoning my charcoal blazer, with deliberate, measured movements. I looked down at the three people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, crazy, and worthless. They were ruined. Their pristine reputations were dead, their finances were exposed, and their freedom was on a rapidly ticking timer. I turned my attention back to the mediator delivering the final devastating truth of the entire ordeal. "That $3.2 million trust they are trying to seize is not going to fund my medical care," I told the mediator, my voice echoing with absolute finality in the silent room. "It is going to keep them both out of a federal penitentiary." The silence that followed my declaration was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. Chloe stared at me, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The undeniable proof of her stolen charity funds sat between us, a radioactive reality she could no longer deny or manipulate. Brad remained completely immobilized, his eyes glassy and unfocused, already visualizing the bars of a federal cell. They were both neutralized, stripped of their power and their prestige in a matter of minutes. But I had severely underestimated the depths of my mother's desperation. Vivian did not break down. She did not fall to pieces or demand answers from the daughter who had just been exposed as a common thief or the son-in-law who had orchestrated a massive federal fraud. Instead, she chose the only path that allowed her to protect the fragile, glittering illusion of her high society existence. She chose utter aggressive delusion. Vivian slammed both of her perfectly manicured hands flat onto the heavy mahogany table. The sharp, explosive sound made even the seasoned mediator flinch. She shot out of her leather chair, her posture rigid, her face contorted into a mask of righteous, terrified fury. "This is exactly what I warned you about, Your Honor," Vivian screamed, her voice shrill and echoing off the glass walls of the conference room. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. "Do you see it now? Do you see the absolute madness we are dealing with?" Judge Harrison held up a hand, attempting to restore order, but Vivian bulldozed right through his gesture. She was a woman fighting for her very survival, fighting to keep her country club memberships, her charity board seats, and her unblemished reputation intact. She was fully prepared to sacrifice her own flesh and blood to maintain that facade. "My daughter is having a severe schizophrenic episode right here in this room," Vivian yelled, her chest heaving as she doubled down on the most vicious lie of all. "These documents are forged. They are fabrications. She has hired people to manufacture these lies because her diseased mind has convinced her that her own family is trying to destroy her. She is hallucinating this entire conspiracy. I watched her perform, feeling a chilling wave of clarity wash over me. She was not just enabling their abuse anymore. She was actively constructing the gallows. She knew the documents were real. She had seen the raw terror in Brad's eyes and the guilty panic in Chloe's face. But acknowledging that truth meant accepting absolute social ruin. It meant becoming a pariah in the only world she cared about. To prevent that, she was willing to sit in a federal court place, her hand on a Bible, and commit perjury to permanently lock me inside a psychiatric facility. "Mrs. Blackwood," Marcus said, his deep voice cutting through her hysteria. "We have provided authenticated banking records. These are not fabrications. Your own son-in-law has not uttered a single word in his own defense because he knows the federal government already has these exact same files." "He is in shock!" Vivian shrieked, pivoting her wild gaze to Marcus. "He is an honorable, respectable man who is currently being subjected to the manic, slanderous delusions of a deeply sick woman. My daughter spent time in a psychiatric clinic 10 years ago. She is unstable. She is dangerous. She needs to be institutionalized immediately before she destroys this family completely." She turned her desperate, pleading eyes back to the mediator. "You have to grant the conservatorship, Judge Harrison. You have to sign the emergency order right now. Look at what she is doing. Look at the elaborate, insane lies she is constructing just to punish us for trying to get her the help she so desperately needs." I remained perfectly still in my chair, my hands folded neatly on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my sanity. I simply let Vivian's shrill, frantic desperation echo in the room, contrasting sharply with my own cold, calculated silence. I wanted the mediator to see the stark difference between the woman they claimed was having a psychotic break and the woman who was actually unraveling before his eyes. "Are you quite finished, Vivian?" I asked, keeping my tone mild and conversational. "Do not speak to me." She spat, her eyes wide and manic. "You are sick. You are a sick, twisted girl, and I will not let you ruin your sister's life because of your paranoid delusions." Judge Harrison rubbed his temples, his face lined with deep exhaustion. He looked at the heavily redacted banking records sitting on the table, then at Brad's catatonic posture, then at Vivian's aggressive defensive posturing. He was a man of the law, accustomed to orderly proceedings and clear-cut evidence. He was not equipped to navigate the toxic, explosive minefield of my family's criminal enterprise masquerading as a medical intervention. "This has gone far beyond the scope of a standard family mediation," Judge Harrison said, his voice heavy with resignation. He gathered his files, tapping them against the mahogany table to align the edges. "I cannot authenticate these financial documents in this room. I cannot verify allegations of federal fraud or municipal embezzlement, and I certainly cannot make a binding determination regarding Miss Wilson's psychiatric competence based on the volatile accusations being hurled across this table." "Your Honor, please," Vivian begged, reaching out a hand. "You have to see that she is making this up. You play golf with Brad. You know our family. What I see, Mrs. Blackwood, is a situation that requires a thorough formal judicial review," Judge Harrison replied coldly, refusing to meet her eyes. He stood up, signaling the absolute end of the proceedings. "I am officially declaring this mediation a failure. I will be notifying the presiding judge that no mutual agreement can be reached under these highly irregular circumstances." He looked directly at me, then at Marcus, and finally at the shattered remnants of my family. "The emergency writ for conservatorship is denied pending a full evidentiary review," Judge Harrison announced. "This case is going to a public trial." Vivian collapsed back into her chair, the fight suddenly draining out of her. A public trial was her absolute worst nightmare. It meant the sealed documents would be opened. It meant the forensic accounting would be entered into the public record. It meant the society bloggers, the investigative journalists, and the local news networks would feast on every sordid illegal detail of Brad's fraud and Chloe's embezzlement. There would be no quiet, polite resolution behind closed doors. Everything was going to be dragged into the unforgiving light. Marcus calmly packed his briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal suit. I looked at my mother, watching the realization of her impending social death wash over her pale features. She had tried to bury me in the dark to save her reputation. Now, I was going to burn her entire world to the ground in front of everyone she had ever tried to impress. 3 weeks later, the morning of the trial arrived with a suffocating, oppressive heat that clung to the limestone pillars of the downtown courthouse. Chloe had not been idle during the 21 days since the mediation imploded. True to her parasitic nature, she had weaponized her extensive social connections, ensuring the courthouse steps were transformed into a sprawling, chaotic media circus. 5 local news vans idled along the curb, their heavy satellite dishes extended toward the pale morning sky. Freelance journalists, high society bloggers, and aggressive paparazzi swarmed the broad concrete plaza, clutching microphones and cameras like weapons. Chloe had meticulously fed them a continuous, calculated narrative of tragic, unavoidable family ruin. She had painted a masterful picture of a brilliant but tragically unstable woman who needed to be saved from herself, and of a devoted, loving family forced to take the heartbreaking step of public litigation just to keep her alive. I watched the spectacle unfold from the tinted rear window of Marcus's idling SUV. Across the plaza, Vivian and Chloe were already putting on the performance of a lifetime. They ascended the courthouse steps slowly, arm in arm, moving with the synchronized, fragile grace of grieving widows. Vivian wore a severe, high-necked navy dress, her face completely obscured by oversized, dark sunglasses. Chloe held her mother's elbow, pausing just long enough at the top of the stairs for the cameras to capture her expression of weary, aristocratic sorrow. They answered no questions, letting their somber, tragic silence speak volumes to the eager reporters. They desperately wanted the world to see them as the helpless victims of my supposed madness. Marcus sat beside me, reviewing a thick stack of manila folders containing the unredacted financial audits, the church scholarship ledger, and the finalized federal subpoenas. He looked up, his eyes scanning the aggressive crowd waiting for us. "Are you ready for this?" Marcus asked, his voice a low, steady rumble of absolute professionalism. "They have stacked the deck out there. The court of public opinion is fully primed to see you as a hostile, paranoid liability." I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored black blazer. I wore no jewelry, no makeup, and no sign of the wealthy, vulnerable heiress they were attempting to portray. I looked exactly like what I was, a corporate executioner preparing to drop the axe. "Let them look, Marcus," I replied, my voice completely devoid of anxiety. "Public opinion does not sign federal indictments." The moment the heavy door of the SUV opened, the plaza erupted. The swarm of reporters descended, shoving digital recorders and flashing cameras into my personal space. The noise was deafening, a chaotic chorus of overlapping accusations disguised as journalistic inquiries. "Maya, is it true you are contesting the medical evaluation? Miss Wilson, how do you respond to your sister's claims of extreme paranoia? Maya, are your companies currently solvent amid this family crisis?" I did not break my stride. I did not raise my hand to shield my face. I walked through the aggressive crowd with a cold, mechanical precision, my eyes fixed entirely on the heavy bronze doors of the courthouse. Marcus matched my pace, his broad shoulders easily parting the sea of aggressive reporters. We moved past the flashing bulbs and the shouted questions in absolute, terrifying silence. We breached the heavy bronze doors, stepping out of the blinding morning sun and into the cool, shadowed cavern of the courthouse vestibule. The immediate drop in ambient noise was jarring. The polished marble floors echoed with the hollow, clipped sounds of leather shoes and snapping briefcases. Before we could reach the main security checkpoint, a figure stepped out from the shadows of a towering limestone pillar, physically blocking my path. It was Brad. He looked wildly different from the arrogant, lounging patriarch who had occupied the mediation room 3 weeks prior. The physical toll of impending federal ruin had carved deep, haggard lines into his face. His eyes were bloodshot, surrounded by bruised purple shadows that spoke of sleepless, panicked nights. Yet despite his obvious physical deterioration, he was desperately clinging to the toxic, unearned arrogance that had shielded him his entire life. Marcus stepped forward to intervene, but I held up a single black-gloved hand, halting him. I wanted to hear exactly what a drowning man sounded like. Brad crowded into my personal space, pulling me slightly away from the direct line of sight of the security guards. He smelled of stale espresso, expensive cologne, and sour, unmistakable terror. "You are making a colossal mistake, Maya." Brad hissed, his voice a ragged, desperate whisper. He leaned in close, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me, falling back on the only tactic he had left. "You think you are so brilliant with your little spreadsheets and your private investigators? You think you have me cornered." I stared at him, my expression entirely blank, letting his panic echo in the quiet alcove. "You are a fool." Brad sneered, his upper lip curling into a mask of pure, ugly contempt. He pointed a shaking finger toward the heavy oak doors of the courtrooms down the hall. "The judge presiding over this conservatorship hearing is Arthur Caldwell. He is an old-school conservative white man. He plays golf at my country club. He has dinner with my senior partners. He belongs to a world you will never, ever understand." Brad stepped closer, his voice dripping with venomous racist condescension. "Do you really think a man like Caldwell is going to look at my tailored suit, my firm's platinum letterhead, my sterling community reputation, and then look at you, a woman with a documented history of clinical institutionalization, and believe your crazy, hysterical conspiracy theories? He is going to look at a broken, aggressive black woman trying to destroy her respectable family, and he is going to lock you away. You are walking into your own slaughter, Maya. The system is built to protect men like me from women like you." He stood there, chest heaving, desperately waiting for me to flinch. He expected me to shrink back, to let the heavy historical weight of systemic bias crush my resolve. He was betting his entire freedom on the fact that an old white judge would instinctively protect a wealthy white financial manager over an independent black woman. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply looked at the dark, sweat-stained collar of his expensive, bespoke shirt. I looked at the frantic, twitching muscle just below his left eye. He was not an apex predator. He was a cornered rat, relying on a corrupt system that could no longer save him. I reached up and slowly, deliberately adjusted the lapel of my black blazer, smoothing out a microscopic, invisible wrinkle. "I don't need him to believe theories, Brad," I said, my voice dropping to a register of absolute freezing calm. "I just need him to read." I stepped around Brad, leaving him paralyzed in the shadows of the vestibule. His threats dissolved into the steady echo of my heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Marcus and I moved in perfect synchronization, pushing through the heavy oak doors of courtroom 302. The air conditioning was running on maximum, yet the room felt suffocatingly tight, thick with the sharp scent of expensive perfume and the electric hum of anticipation. The space was already packed to its absolute capacity. The gallery was a sea of tailored suits, designer dresses, and the hungry faces of local journalists practically vibrating with excitement. Vivian sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by Richard Sterling, the family's high-priced lead litigator. Chloe sat beside our mother, dabbing her dry eyes with a monogrammed linen handkerchief. When they saw me walk down the center aisle and take my seat next to Marcus at the defense table, their postures stiffened into rigid, performative grief. Judge Arthur Caldwell entered the room, his black robes billowing like a storm cloud as he took the bench. He was exactly the kind of man Brad had described. He possessed silver hair, a stern, aristocratic jawline, and the authoritative scowl of a judge who demanded absolute, unquestioning compliance in his domain. He struck his wooden gavel, once the sharp crack instantly silencing the murmuring gallery. He seated the jury, a 12-person panel carefully curated by Sterling during the selection process, to lean heavily conservative and sympathetic to the established upper class. Sterling wasted no time setting the stage. He stood up slowly, buttoning his pristine navy suit jacket, and called his very first witness. Chloe stood up, smoothing the skirt of her modest beige linen dress. She had deliberately abandoned her usual flashy diamonds, heavy makeup, and aggressive stilettos for sensible flats and bare wrists. She looked entirely demure. She looked exactly like a grieving, exhausted sister, carrying the impossible weight of the world on her shoulders. She swore on the Bible, took the stand, and folded her hands delicately in her lap. Sterling approached the wooden podium, offering Chloe a gentle, patronizing smile designed to put her at ease. He asked her to describe her relationship with her younger sister. Chloe looked directly at me, her eyes brimming with manufactured sorrow. She let out a long, shuddering breath that echoed perfectly through the courtroom microphones, a masterclass in theatrical timing. "I love Maya," Chloe said, her voice trembling with practiced precision. "I have always loved her. She is my little sister. But the sister I grew up with is gone. The person sitting at that table is a stranger to me, consumed by a terrible sickness we have tried desperately to cure." Sterling guided her through a masterful, devastating narrative. Chloe did not paint me as evil or malicious. That would have been too obvious and easily contested. Instead, she painted me as a tragic, helpless victim of my own rapidly deteriorating mind. She spun a harrowing tale of my supposed descent into madness over the past 5 years, speaking with the weary cadence of a caregiver pushed to the brink. It started with the isolation, Chloe testified, wiping a single perfect tear from her cheek. Maya withdrew from everyone. She stopped coming to family dinners. She stopped attending holiday galas or returning our phone calls. We thought she was just going through a difficult phase, maybe experiencing some mild depression. But then it got worse. So much worse. She started locking herself in her room for days at a time, refusing to see the sun or speak to anyone. Sterling stepped closer to the jury box, resting his hand on the wooden rail, ensuring the panel was hanging on her every word. "And what did you observe when she locked herself away, Miss Wilson?" Chloe swallowed hard, looking down at her hands as if the memory was too painful to bear. "My mother and I would stand outside her bedroom door, terrified, begging her to come out and eat something. But we would just hear her muttering. She would have these rapid, intense conversations with people who were not there. She would pace the floor, heavily arguing with imaginary voices late into the night. She would draw strange diagrams on her walls. It broke my mother's heart to hear her slipping away from us." I sat perfectly still, my expression utterly blank, while the gallery behind me let out a collective sympathetic gasp. I knew exactly what she was describing. 5 years ago, I was deep in the initial development phase of my flagship healthcare algorithm. Those rapid, intense conversations were verbal debugging sessions. I was dictating code logic aloud, running through complex machine learning variables, speaking to offshore developers over a headset while grinding through 70-hour work weeks. I was building a multi-million-dollar technology infrastructure from the ground up. Chloe was brilliantly reframing my relentless work ethic and technical focus as a schizophrenic breakdown. Sterling pressed further, his tone softening with faux concern, asking how this behavior escalated into the current legal crisis. "She became violently paranoid." Chloe continued, her voice cracking flawlessly on the final word. "She started accusing us of trying to steal from her. She claimed my husband was watching her bank accounts and hacking her emails. She told my mother that the family business was a fraud and that everyone was out to get her. We tried to get her into therapy. We offered to pay for the best private facilities in the country out of our own pockets, but her delusions made her aggressive. She started hoarding her money, hiding assets, and spinning these wild, intricate conspiracy theories about us, trying to ruin her life." Chloe looked directly at the jury, her eyes wide and pleading. "We are just trying to save her. She has a sizable trust fund, and her mental state makes her incredibly vulnerable to financial predators who would take advantage of her confusion. She is erratic and hostile. My mother and I have exhausted every single emotional and financial resource trying to manage her care privately. We are exhausted. We are terrified that if she is left to her own devices, she will destroy herself completely. We are only asking for this conservatorship because we have absolutely no other choice left to keep her safe." It was a flawless execution of gaslighting on a judicial scale. Chloe had effectively preempted every piece of evidence I was about to introduce. By framing my financial independence as sick hoarding and my investigations into their municipal fraud as paranoid delusions, she had handed the jury a predetermined lens through which to view all my upcoming testimony. Any proof of embezzlement I presented would now be seen as the fabricated obsession of a sick mind. Sterling thanked her softly, projecting a look of deep patriarchal sympathy, and returned to his seat at the plaintiff's table. I did not need to look behind me to feel the massive shift in the room. The atmosphere had completely crystallized against me. The reporters in the gallery were furiously typing on their phones and scribbling notes, clearly already drafting the tragic headlines of the fallen, unstable heiress. The jurors leaned back in their heavy wooden chairs, their faces softened by an overwhelming, suffocating pity. Several of them looked directly at me and shook their heads, sadly entirely convinced they were looking at a broken, delusional woman who desperately needed to be institutionalized for her own good. At the plaintiff's table, Vivian dabbed her eyes with a fresh tissue, playing the heartbroken mother to absolute perfection. But I saw the subtle, rigid tension in her shoulders finally relax. Beside her, Richard Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Marcus, offering a small, incredibly smug smile. He was a man who believed he had just delivered a fatal, unrecoverable blow. He believed he had secured a slam-dunk victory before the defense had even spoken a single word. Richard Sterling let the heavy, stifling silence of Chloe's testimony settle over the jury box like a thick blanket. He wanted them to marinate in the manufactured tragedy, to fully absorb the image of a family pushed to the absolute brink by a madwoman. When he finally stood, he did not look at me. He looked at Judge Caldwell, projecting an aura of solemn professional grief. "The plaintiff calls Vivian Blackwood Sterling," announced. My mother rose from her chair with the slow, deliberate grace of a martyr ascending the scaffold. She smoothed the front of her tailored navy dress, her posture perfectly communicating the exhausting burden of a mother who had sacrificed everything for an ungrateful child. As she took the oath and sat in the witness box, she offered Judge Caldwell a fragile, trembling smile. The judge, a man who regularly attended the same elite charity galas as my parents, returned her gaze with unmistakable deferential sympathy. Brad was right about one thing. The system in this room was built for them. Sterling approached the podium, his voice dropping to a gentle conversational tone. "Mrs. Blackwood, we have heard your eldest daughter testify regarding Maya's severe emotional instability, but a conservatorship is fundamentally a financial mechanism. Can you explain to the court why you believe your daughter is incapable of managing her own estate?" Vivian sighed, a sound so full of maternal heartbreak it belonged on a Broadway stage. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with a terrifyingly convincing sorrow. "Maya has been entirely dependent on this family financially since she was 21 years old." Vivian testified, her voice echoing clearly through the hushed courtroom. "She has never been able to hold down a job. We tried to set her up with entry-level positions at her father's firm. We introduced her to colleagues, but her erratic behavior always resulted in immediate termination. For the last decade, my husband and I have quietly paid her rent, covered her living expenses, and managed every single aspect of her financial life. She simply cannot function in the real world." The lies flowed from her mouth with chilling, effortless precision. She was painting me as a complete incompetent, a financial parasite draining the family resources while battling imaginary demons. Every word she spoke was direct, unadulterated perjury. She claimed she bought my groceries. She claimed she paid my utilities. She swore under oath that my entire existence was subsidized by her endless generosity. I sat beside Marcus, keeping my face entirely impassive. I did not shake my head. I did not glare. I merely watched my mother lay the bricks of her own federal prison cell. "She has absolutely no concept of money or financial literacy," Vivian continued, turning her pleading eyes to the jury. The jurors leaned forward, utterly captivated by the elegant matriarch bearing her family's shame. "She does not even know how to balance a checkbook. Giving her $3.2 million is equivalent to handing a toddler a loaded gun. She will be targeted by predators. She will be destitute in a matter of months, and she will likely end up on the streets. We are petitioning for this conservatorship because it is the only way we can ensure she does not starve." A soft murmur of deep pity rippled through the gallery behind me. I could feel the hostile stares boring into my back. In the eyes of everyone in that courtroom, I was a tragic, unstable liability, a danger to myself, and a heavy cross for my upstanding family to bear. Sterling let the devastating impact of Vivian's statement hang in the air. He turned to the judge, nodding respectfully. "No further questions, Your Honor." Sterling returned to the plaintiff's table, settling into his leather chair with the relaxed posture of a man who had already won the war. He had established my medical incompetence through Chloe and my financial incompetence through Vivian. The narrative was bulletproof. Judge Caldwell peered over his reading glasses, directing a stern, unforgiving glare toward my side of the room. "Mr. Vance," the judge prompted, addressing my attorney, "you may cross-examine the witness." The entire courtroom collectively held its breath. The reporters poised their pens, ready to record a brutal, emotional screaming match between a hostile daughter and her long-suffering mother. They expected Marcus to tear into Vivian, to aggressively challenge her timeline, to demand proof of the rent checks she claimed to have paid. They expected a chaotic, desperate defense. Marcus stood up calmly, buttoning his dark suit jacket. He did not step out from behind the defense table. He did not grab a single file or sheet of paper. He simply looked at Vivian, who braced herself for an attack, her chin raised in aristocratic defiance. "The defense declines to cross-examine this witness." "Your Honor." Marcus stated, his voice resonating with cold, absolute finality. "We have no questions for Mrs. Blackwood at this time." A shockwave tore through the courtroom. A loud, collective gasp erupted from the gallery, followed immediately by a frantic buzzing of whispers. The reporters stopped writing, staring at Marcus in utter bewilderment. Declining to cross-examine the star witness in a conservatorship hearing was tantamount to a legal surrender. It was professional suicide. At the plaintiff's table, Sterling's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a sharp, calculating frown. He looked at Marcus, his eyes narrowing as he tried to identify the trap. Vivian sat frozen in the witness box, completely destabilized by the lack of conflict. She had prepared for a fight. She had memorized her defensive lines. Being dismissed so casually left her looking confused and suddenly vulnerable. Judge Caldwell banged his gavel, demanding order. "Are you entirely sure, Mr. Vance? You are waiving your right to question the petitioner." "We are entirely sure, Your Honor," Marcus replied smoothly, his demeanor completely unruffled by the chaos around him. "Very well," Judge Caldwell said, his tone thick with suspicion. "The witness may step down." Vivian rose slowly, casting a bewildered glance at Sterling before returning to her seat. The air in the room was thick with confusion. The jury looked between Marcus and me, clearly wondering if we had simply given up the fight. "If the defense has no further procedural motions," Judge Caldwell announced, "we will move to closing statements." "We do have a motion, Your Honor," Marcus interjected, his voice cutting through the tension like a steel blade. "The defense would like to call our first and only witness. We call Bradley Kensington to the stand to present his expert financial portfolio regarding the estate in question." The color instantly drained from Brad's face. He sat rigid at the plaintiff's table, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated terror. He looked at Sterling, but the high-priced lawyer was already scrambling through his notes, utterly blindsided by the maneuver. The trap had just slammed shut. Brad remained glued to his leather chair for a fraction of a second. The sheer, unadulterated terror I had seen in the vestibule flashed violently across his face. But men like Brad were conditioned to survive in predatory environments. They were taught that confidence could mask any deficit, that projecting absolute authority could bend reality to their will. I watched the transformation happen in real time. Brad inhaled sharply, squared his broad shoulders, and forced the blood back into his face. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket with a sharp, practiced flick of his wrists. By the time he stepped out from behind the plaintiff's table and walked toward the witness box, The cornered rat had vanished. The arrogant, untouchable financial titan had returned. He raised his right hand, swore the oath with a crisp, booming voice, and sat down. He crossed his legs, resting one ankle casually over his knee, looking less like a man under oath and more like a keynote speaker at an executive summit. Marcus approached the podium, his demeanor completely unreadable and his hands entirely empty. Mr. Kensington, Marcus began, his voice devoid of any hostility. As the proposed conservator of Miss Wilson's estate, the court needs to understand your financial qualifications. You are asserting that you are uniquely equipped to manage a trust valued at over $3 million. Please explain your background to the court. Brad smiled. It was a slick, blindingly white smile aimed directly at Judge Caldwell. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick, glossy binder embossed with the gold crest of Apex Financial. He handed it to the bailiff with a polite nod, watching as the heavy document was carried up to the judge's bench. I am a senior managing partner at Apex Financial, Brad stated, projecting his voice effortlessly to reach the back of the gallery. I oversee a private wealth management division handling in excess of $50 million in liquid assets. My firm specializes in aggressive growth strategies utilizing proprietary algorithmic trading and diversified offshore risk mitigation. We do not just protect wealth, Your Honor, we multiply it. Judge Caldwell adjusted his reading glasses, flipping open the glossy portfolio. He looked suitably impressed by the heavy cardstock, the immaculate formatting, and the intricate, colorful pie charts detailing Brad's supposed market victories. Furthermore, Brad continued, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the rail of the witness box, speaking to the judge as if they were sharing a glass of expensive scotch at the country club bar. Apex Financial is directly backed by Vanguard Holdings. We operate under their massive corporate umbrella. This gives my division unprecedented access to institutional tier investment vehicles, high-yield municipal bonds, and global equity markets that standard retail investors simply cannot touch. My fiduciary duty demands absolute financial supremacy, and Vanguard Holdings provides the architecture for that success. Brad turned his gaze toward me, his lip curling into a distinct razor-sharp sneer. The gallery hung on his every word. Vivian sat up straighter, her chest swelling with renewed triumphant pride. Sterling, the family lawyer, relaxed his posture, completely abandoning his earlier panic. Sterling clearly believed Brad was hitting a home run. With all due respect to my sister-in-law, Brad said, his voice dripping with heavy patriarchal condescension. Maya is a creative individual. She lives in a world of abstract ideas and computer code. She does not possess the fundamental financial literacy required to comprehend the complex algorithms of modern wealth management. She lacks the psychological fortitude to navigate aggressive market volatility. If left in her control, this trust will be decimated by inflation and poor emotional decision-making. As her family, as a financial expert backed by one of the largest holding companies in the world, I am stepping in to ensure her future is secured. She needs a steady hand at the wheel. Your Honor, and I am the only one qualified to provide it. He sat back, adjusting his silk tie, the undisputed master of the room. He had tossed around the financial jargon flawlessly. He had painted himself as the ultimate savior, the brilliant corporate mind rescuing a hysterical, incompetent woman from her own financial ruin. He had played directly to the judge's conservative, patriarchal sensibilities. Marcus did not interrupt. He did not object. He stood quietly at the podium, letting Brad spin his golden web of lies until the courtroom was completely wrapped in it. Are you quite finished, Mr. Kensington? Marcus asked mildly. I believe my portfolio speaks for itself, Brad replied, offering a dismissive, arrogant shrug. Marcus nodded slowly. He reached into the inner pocket of his dark suit jacket and withdrew a single standard-sized manila envelope. It was sealed with heavy red wax and stamped with the official, undeniable insignia of the federal government. The courtroom fell entirely silent. The sound of Marcus's shoes on the polished floor echoed sharply as he walked over to the bailiff. Your Honor, Marcus said, handing the envelope over. The defense requests that this document be entered into evidence and reviewed by the bench immediately. It pertains directly to the Vanguard Holdings affiliation Mr. Kensington just testified to under oath. Brad's smug smile faltered just for a millimeter. He uncrossed his legs, planting both feet flat on the floor. Sterling sat forward, his brow furrowing in sudden, sharp suspicion. Judge Caldwell accepted the envelope from the bailiff. He broke the red wax seal with a sharp snap that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He pulled out a stack of dense, tightly typed pages bearing the seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The courtroom waited in breathless anticipation. I watched Judge Caldwell's face. He was an old-school conservative judge, a man who respected power, wealth, and authority. He had been nodding along with Brad's testimony just moments ago. But as his eyes scanned the first page of the document Marcus had provided, the color began to rapidly drain from his aristocratic face. The silence stretched out, becoming heavy and unbearable. The only sound was the rustling of paper as Judge Caldwell turned to the second page, then the third. His breathing became shallow, his jaw locked with rigid, terrifying tension. The judge was realizing that the man sitting in his witness box had not just committed perjury, but was actively attempting to use the state court system to launder stolen funds. He looked up from the federal document and stared down at Brad's thick, glossy portfolio from Apex Financial sitting on his desk. He looked at the gold-embossed crest. He looked at the fabricated charts. He looked at the name Vanguard Holdings, which the federal document had just explicitly identified as a defunct fraudulent shell company under active criminal investigation. Then Judge Caldwell slowly lowered the documents. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at Brad. He looked dead at Chloe. Judge Caldwell did not blink. His eyes, previously softened by the polished facade of the local aristocracy, were now twin chips of freezing gray flint. He raised his hand, holding Brad's heavy, glossy portfolio from Apex Financial suspended in the air for one terrible, agonizing second. Then he let it go. The judge drops Brad's portfolio onto his desk. The loud smack echoes in the silent courtroom. He stares at Chloe and Vivian, his voice laced with absolute disbelief. "Ms. Chloe, you sat up here and swore under oath that your sister is mentally ill, destitute, and incapable of managing a single dollar." Chloe shrank back into her leather chair. The demure, tragic sister act she had perfected over the last hour evaporated instantly under the judge's piercing scrutiny. She looked frantically to Richard Sterling for help, but the high-priced litigator was staring blankly at the dropped portfolio, his legal instincts screaming that the ground had just given way beneath them. "Yes, Your Honor," Chloe answers, her voice shaking. The judge leans forward. "Do you actually know who she really is?" The question hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Chloe opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. She glanced wildly at our mother. Vivian was gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table so hard her knuckles were bone white. Vivian's perfectly constructed mask of maternal sorrow was fracturing rapidly, revealing the raw, panicked desperation underneath. The gallery behind them was absolutely motionless, sensing the impending execution. "I asked you a question, Ms. Chloe," Judge Caldwell barked, the sudden volume making half the reporters in the room jump. "You petitioned this court to strip a grown woman of her fundamental civil liberties. You stood before me and painted a picture of a deranged, impoverished shut-in. I want to know if you have even the slightest comprehension of the financial entity sitting across the aisle from you right now." "Your Honor," Sterling finally interjected, standing up with a sudden jerky movement, "I must object to the tone of this inquiry. My clients have presented expert financial testimony regarding the estate and the urgent need for intervention." Judge Caldwell turned his wrath toward the lawyer. "Expert testimony, Mr. Sterling. Are you referring to the man currently sweating through his custom suit in my witness box?" Brad shifted frantically, his face glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Your Honor, I can explain the market variables regarding my firm. You will remain entirely silent, Mr. Kensington." Caldwell snapped, slicing his hand through the air with undeniable authority. "Or I will hold you in contempt and have the bailiff place you in handcuffs immediately. Do you understand me?" Brad swallowed hard, his throat bobbing prominently. He nodded rapidly, shrinking back into the wooden chair looking like a deflated balloon. The swagger and arrogance that had filled the room just minutes prior had completely vanished. Judge Caldwell picked up the top sheet of the federal document Marcus had submitted. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the heavy black text. Mr. Kensington has just testified under oath that his wealth management division at Apex Financial operates under the direct backing and corporate umbrella of Vanguard Holdings. He used this specific affiliation to assert his absolute financial supremacy and to justify his proposed control over the respondent's assets. The judge looked back up, his eyes sweeping mercilessly over the plaintiff's table. According to this unredacted briefing from the Securities and Exchange Commission delivered in conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Vanguard Holdings is not a multinational corporate backer. It is a defunct, fraudulent shell company. It is currently the primary target of a massive federal probe into offshore embezzlement, wire fraud, and the gross mismanagement of municipal bonds. A collective gasp ripped through the gallery. The journalists practically threw themselves over the wooden railing, their pens flying across their notepads, digital recorders shoved as far forward as possible. Brad had just confessed to federal fraud on the public record. He had confidently walked into a state courtroom, handed the presiding judge a fake portfolio, and bragged at length about his connection to an active criminal enterprise. "Your Honor," Sterling stammered, his face draining of all color. "The defense has ambushed us with these documents. We had no prior knowledge of any federal investigations. You are litigating a conservatorship for an estate you clearly know absolutely nothing about." Caldwell thundered, his voice echoing off the limestone pillars. "You brought a documented fraud into my courtroom to manage a portfolio that dwarfs anything this so-called expert has ever touched." Vivian stood up, her composure completely shattered. "That is a lie!" she shrieked, pointing a shaking manicured finger at me. "Maya is broke. She lives in a fantasy world. She writes computer code in the dark. She has been living off my charity for 10 years. She is sick." Order, Caldwell roared, striking his gavel with bone-rattling force. "Sit down immediately, Mrs. Blackwood, or you will be physically removed from these proceedings." Vivian collapsed back into her chair, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with panic. The reality she had meticulously constructed was burning to the ground, and the flames were spreading far too fast for her to extinguish. Judge Caldwell turned his attention to me. I sat completely still beside Marcus, my hands resting lightly on the defense table. I wore my tailored black blazer like armor. I met the judge's gaze with the calm, unwavering certainty of a woman who had spent years preparing for this exact moment. The documents provided by the defense paint a vastly different picture of reality than the one the petitioners have fabricated today," Caldwell said, his voice projecting a sudden begrudging respect that echoed through the cavernous room. "They outline a sprawling, highly sophisticated technology infrastructure. They detail proprietary algorithms currently utilized by over 400 major healthcare networks worldwide. They list exclusive patents, offshore intellectual property holdings, and massive private equity investments." The judge paused, letting the sheer weight of the assets settle over the stunned room. "According to these federal audits, the respondent, Maya Blackwood, is the sole founder and majority shareholder of a technology enterprise recently valued in excess of $80 million. She is not destitute. She is not a dependent. She is the most financially solvent individual in this entire building." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a bomb detonating and sucking all the oxygen from the room. They had spent the last hour trying to convince the world that I was a broken, incompetent child, playing with imaginary numbers. They had dragged me into the public square, inviting the media to watch them steal a $3 million trust fund, entirely unaware that I had spent the last 5 years building an $80 million empire in the shadows. They had tried to cage a predator, thinking it was prey. Brad made a choked, strangled sound in the back of his throat. His lucrative, fraudulent world had just evaporated. He was looking at federal prison time, and he had handed the evidence directly to the man sitting on the bench. The courtroom goes dead silent. Chloe and Vivian's faces turn pale as the judge holds up the sealed document for everyone to see. The state seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission gleamed in the harsh light. Vivian clutched the edge of the plaintiff's table, her knuckles white, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. Richard Sterling sat completely frozen, a man who realized he had just driven his career off a cliff at full speed. "Your Honor," Marcus said, breaking the suffocating silence. "The defense requests permission to utilize the courtroom monitors to display the contents of the federal audit for the jury and the petitioners." "Proceed," Mr. Vance Caldwell instructed, waving his hand toward the audio-visual cart. Marcus stepped over to the evidence podium and connected a sleek, black tablet. The 4 massive flat screens mounted around the courtroom flickered to life. The jurors leaned forward in their chairs, completely engrossed. The reporters in the gallery stopped breathing, their eyes glued to the bright displays. "Let us clarify the exact nature of the estate the petitioners are attempting to seize," Marcus announced, his voice ringing with absolute commanding authority. He tapped the screen. A complex, interconnected corporate flowchart appeared. At the very bottom, in small, insignificant text, was Apex Financial, Brad's company. "Mr. Kensington has testified that he is a senior managing partner at Apex Financial," Marcus continued, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "He testified that his firm is backed by a massive parent company called Vanguard Holdings. He used this connection to establish his dominance, his expertise, and his supposed superiority over my client." Marcus tapped the screen again. The chart zoomed in, highlighting the thick black line connecting Apex Financial to Vanguard Holdings. "What Mr. Kensington failed to realize," Marcus said, turning to look directly at Brad, who was visibly trembling in the witness box, "is the actual ownership structure of his own parent company. Vanguard Holdings is not just a backer. It is a multi-billion-dollar international hedge fund. It wholly owns Apex Financial. Apex is merely a minor expendable subsidiary in a massive global portfolio." Marcus tapped the screen a third time. The corporate hierarchy of Vanguard Holdings materialized on the monitors. The text was large, bold, and entirely undeniable. The jury gasped. The gallery erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers before Judge Caldwell slammed his gavel, demanding immediate silence. "Listed at the very top of the Vanguard Holdings executive structure," Marcus said, raising his voice over the dying murmurs, "is the anonymous founder, the majority shareholder, and the chief executive officer." The name on the screen was Maya Blackwood. I sat perfectly still, my posture completely relaxed, letting the absolute magnitude of the revelation crush the oxygen out of my family's lungs. I was not a dependent. I was not a sick, helpless girl living off her mother's charity. I was the architect of a financial empire that swallowed their entire world whole. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless sound. She stared at the screen, then at me, her eyes wide with a horrific, mind-shattering realization. The daughter she had dismissed as a useless burden, the woman she had just committed blatant perjury to destroy, was a financial titan of incomprehensible power. Chloe covered her mouth with both hands, shaking her head back and forth in frantic, pathetic denial. Her tears were no longer manufactured. They were the very real, very bitter tears of absolute ruin. "Let us address the so-called delusions and paranoia described by the petitioners." Marcus continued, pivoting to dismantle Chloe's entire performance. Miss Chloe testified that her sister locked herself in her room, muttering to imaginary people at all hours of the night. Marcus brought up a new document on the screens. It was a log of encrypted international conference calls, complete with timestamps and geographic locations. "My client was not speaking to imaginary people," Marcus stated, his tone dripping with freezing contempt. "She was conducting secure, high-level board meetings with senior financial directors in Tokyo, London, and Dubai. She was managing a global hedge fund across 4 different time zones. The isolation was not depression. It was the absolute, relentless dedication required to run a multi-billion-dollar enterprise." Chloe shrank down in her seat, her demure, tragic act completely annihilated. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap she built had just snapped shut on her own neck. "And what about the erratic scribblings on the walls?" Marcus asked, refusing to give them a single second to breathe. "The strange diagrams that convinced her family she was losing her mind. The screens shifted again, displaying incredibly complex, intricate mathematical formulas and data flow charts. These are algorithmic risk models, Marcus explained to the stunned jury. These are proprietary, highly classified financial forecasting models designed by my client. She was not drawing conspiracy theories. She was actively mapping out market volatility and, more importantly, tracing the exact flow of embezzled funds being siphoned out of Vanguard subsidiaries by fraudulent wealth managers. Marcus turned and pointed a single steady finger directly at Brad. Managers exactly like Bradley Kensington. Brad's face was the color of wet ash. The sweat was pouring down his forehead, soaking the collar of his expensive, custom-tailored shirt. He gripped the wooden rail of the witness stand so hard the wood groaned under the pressure. His mind was violently short-circuiting as he desperately tried to process the catastrophic reality crashing down on him. He had spent years patronizing me at family dinners. He had called me a failure. He had mocked my intelligence, belittled my independence, and conspired to steal my trust fund to cover his own illegal financial losses. He had marched into a courtroom to declare me legally incompetent, fully believing he was the smartest, most powerful man in the room. Now, staring at the SEC filings glowing on the monitors, Brad realized the horrifying, inescapable truth. The quiet, invisible sister-in-law he had ruthlessly mocked was the apex predator of his entire industry. She was the anonymous billionaire he had been trying to impress his entire career. I was his ultimate boss. Brad let out a ragged, choking gasp. His knees buckled completely, his legs giving out beneath him. He sagged heavily against the wooden rail of the witness stand, physically unable to support the weight of his own destruction, while the courtroom watched his arrogant world burn to ash. Two uniformed bailiffs immediately stepped forward, grabbing Brad by his tailored sleeves and hauling him upright. He offered no resistance. The fight had been entirely drained from his body, leaving behind an empty, sweating shell. Judge Caldwell watched with absolute disgust as the former financial titan was practically dragged back to the plaintiff's table and shoved into his chair. Richard Sterling scooted his seat inches away from his own client, treating Brad like a man infected with a highly contagious career-ending disease. "Order," Judge Caldwell commanded, his voice slicing through the chaotic murmurs of the press gallery. "We will maintain decorum in this courtroom. Mr. Vance, does the defense have any further evidence to present regarding the respondent's financial competency?" "We do, Your Honor." Marcus replied, his tone remaining perfectly level. "The defense calls Maya Blackwood to the stand." The rustling in the gallery ceased instantly. I stood up, smoothing the front of my black blazer, and walked past my mother and sister. Vivian refused to look at me. Her gaze was locked on the floor, her chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. Chloe was staring blankly at the digital monitors, still trapped in the horrific realization that her entire carefully curated life was a lie. I stepped into the witness box. The clerk approached, holding out a worn Bible. I placed my left hand on the cover, raised my right hand, and swore to tell the truth. The whole truth and nothing but the truth. As I sat down, I looked directly at Judge Caldwell. I did not shrink under his gaze. I did not fidget. I sat with the posture of a woman who managed billions of dollars before breakfast. Miss Blackwood, Marcus began, stepping up to the podium. "Let us address the primary asset at the center of this conservatorship petition. Your mother and sister are attempting to seize control of a trust fund valued at $3.2 million. They have testified under oath that this money was an inheritance left exclusively to you by your late grandmother. Is that correct?" "That is what they testified to." "Yes," I answered clearly, ensuring every person in the room could hear me. "And is that testimony factual?" Marcus asked. "No, it is a complete fabrication," I stated. Sterling jumped up his chair, scraping violently against the floor. "Objection. The defense is introducing entirely new claims without foundation. My clients have provided the official trust documentation." "Overruled." Judge Caldwell snapped instantly, not even looking at the lawyer. "I am highly interested in what Miss Blackwood has to say. Proceed." Marcus brought up a new file on his tablet. The four massive monitors flickered, replacing the Vanguard Holdings corporate structure with a series of bank statements, loan applications, and property deeds. Miss Blackwood Marcus said, gesturing to the screens, "Can you please explain the actual financial state of your grandmother's estate at the time of her passing?" "My grandmother died completely penniless," I replied, my voice steady despite the familiar bitter ache in my chest. When she passed away 4 years ago, her primary asset was the family estate in Oak Creek. The property was originally fully paid off. However, in the 2 years leading up to her death, my mother, Vivian Blackwood, assumed power of attorney over her finances. I looked directly at Vivian. She flinched as if she had been physically struck, her shoulders hunching inward. During that time, I continued. My mother secretly took out 3 separate, highly predatory mortgages against the Oak Creek estate. She drained my grandmother's retirement accounts and liquidated her entire stock portfolio. She funneled every single dollar into funding my sister's lavish lifestyle. The courtroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. Judge Caldwell struck his gavel twice, demanding absolute quiet. "Are you stating that Vivian Blackwood embezzled from her own mother to fund Chloe Blackwood's expenses?" the judge asked, leaning forward, his eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "That is exactly what I am stating, Your Honor," I replied. Chloe required seed money for a failing fashion boutique. She required luxury cars, she could not afford expensive international vacations, and a socialite lifestyle built entirely on a mountain of hidden debt. My mother funded all of it, using my grandmother's equity. By the time my grandmother passed away, the Oak Creek estate was in massive default. The bank was actively initiating foreclosure proceedings. Vivian and Chloe were 90 days away from being evicted and put out on the street. Marcus tapped his screen again. A thick document bearing the seal of a private holding company appeared on the monitors. If the estate was in foreclosure, Marcus asked, pacing slowly back to the defense table, where did the $3.2 million in the current trust fund come from? "It came from me," I said. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the reporters stopped typing, their hands frozen over their keyboards. "I could not allow my family to become homeless," I explained, keeping my gaze fixed firmly on the judge. Despite everything they had done to me, despite the years of emotional neglect and financial abuse, I refused to watch my mother lose the roof over her head. But I also knew that if I handed Vivian a check, she would immediately funnel it back into Chloe's bottomless pit of debt. She would squander it within a year and end up right back where she started. "So what did you do?" Marcus prompted. "I instructed my legal team to establish a ghost entity," I stated. "I authorized the transfer of $3.2 million from one of my offshore accounts directly into a blind trust. I used that trust to anonymously purchase the Oak Creek estate directly from the bank clearing the default. I structured the financial vehicle to pay the property taxes, the maintenance fees, and a modest monthly living stipend for Vivian and Chloe. I deliberately disguised the trust to look like a final hidden asset left behind by my grandmother, managed by a faceless corporate entity." I turned my gaze toward Brad Kensington. He was staring at me with hollow, lifeless eyes. "Mr. Kensington, who sits before you claiming to be a financial savior," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal temperature, did not even realize the trust he was attempting to manage was legally tethered to his own parent company. He was trying to embezzle my money using my own corporate infrastructure. Vivian let out a loud, agonizing sob. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the reality of her exposure set in. Chloe sat paralyzed, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wooden table, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute terror and devastating humiliation. The narrative they had sold to the world, the story of their superiority and my pathetic dependence, was completely obliterated. They had been living off my secret charity for 4 entire years. Miss Blackwood, Marcus said softly, letting the silence stretch out for maximum impact. "Your mother and sister brought you into this courtroom today to declare you mentally unfit. They petitioned the state to strip you of your civil liberties so they could gain direct access to that specific trust fund." I looked at the 2 women sitting across the aisle. I looked at the high-priced lawyer they had hired and the fraudulent financial manager they had brought in to legitimize their theft. I felt no pity. I felt no sadness. I only felt the cold, hard certainty of absolute justice. I turned my attention back to Judge Caldwell, delivering the final crushing blow. "They aren't trying to steal my inheritance," I told the stunned courtroom. "They are trying to steal the charity I gave them to keep a roof over their heads." I stood up from the defense table, ignoring Richard Sterling's furious, panicked scribbling and the absolute devastation painted across my mother's face. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, turning my attention completely to the man sweating through his expensive silk tie in the witness box. Brad was practically hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery, as if calculating his chances of making a run for it. "Bradley!" I said, my voice cutting through the thick silence like a scalpel. "You sat in my house, drank my wine, and told me I was a pathetic shut-in who needed a strong man to manage her affairs. You built an entire career on the illusion of power, completely oblivious to the fact that you were playing with my money." He opened his mouth, a pathetic squeak escaping his throat, but I did not let him speak. "As the chief executive officer and sole founder of Vanguard Holdings," I continued, my voice echoing off the courtroom walls, "I am officially terminating your employment at Apex Financial, effective immediately. You are fired for gross financial misconduct, embezzlement, and a spectacular breach of fiduciary duty." Brad slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. A low groan escaped him. "But losing your job is the least of your problems," I added, stepping closer to the witness box. "You thought you were so clever, siphoning off municipal bond yields into offshore accounts. You failed to realize that the algorithms you were trying to beat were written by me. I tracked every single penny you stole. I handed that data directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission 6 months ago. And if you look out into the hallway, you will notice 2 federal agents from the FBI waiting by the elevators. They are very eager to speak with you about wire fraud." Brad's head snapped up, his eyes wide with stark, unadulterated terror. He looked past me toward the frosted glass of the courtroom doors, where the shadowy silhouettes of 2 men in suits were clearly visible. He let out a strangled whimper and collapsed back against his chair, completely broken. I turned on my heel and faced my sister. Chloe was pressed so hard into her seat, she looked like she was trying to merge with the leather. The demure, tragic victim persona was gone, replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed stare of a cornered rat. "You always loved playing the generous socialite, Chloe," I said, walking toward the plaintiff's table. "You loved hosting those extravagant galas for the Children's Literacy Foundation, making sure everyone saw you handing out oversized checks. It made you feel important. It made you feel superior." Chloe shook her head rapidly, holding up her hands as if to physically ward off my words. "Maya, please," she choked out, her voice a ragged whisper. "Do not do this. You should have thought about that before you tried to have me locked in a psychiatric facility." I replied without an ounce of pity. "You thought you could cover the mortgages our mother took out by skimming off the top of your charity's general fund. You embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for underprivileged children to pay for your designer shoes and country club dues." The gallery erupted in furious murmurs. The press corps was practically vibrating with the scandal of it all. "I know about the skimmed funds," I stated, raising my voice to be heard over the rising noise, "because I am the primary anonymous donor for the Children's Literacy Foundation. I demanded a full forensic audit of my contributions last week. The charity's board of directors received the complete file of your fraudulent wire transfers this morning at 8 o'clock. They are currently drafting their civil suit against you right alongside the district attorney's criminal referral." Chloe let out a sharp, piercing wail. She folded completely in half, resting her head on her knees, sobbing with a deep, ugly sound that echoed through the room. Judge Caldwell had seen enough. His face was a mask of cold, righteous fury. He picked up his wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp, resounding crack that instantly silenced the room. "This court is utterly appalled," Caldwell boomed, his voice vibrating with absolute rage. He glared down at the plaintiff's table, his eyes locking on to Sterling, who looked as if he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Mr. Sterling, you brought a petition into my courtroom based entirely on perjury, malice, and criminal greed. You attempted to use the authority of the state to facilitate the theft of millions of dollars from a highly capable, immensely successful woman. Sterling stood up, his hands shaking as he gripped his briefcase. Your Honor, I was completely unaware of these facts. My clients misled me. Save it for the disciplinary committee, Mr. Sterling Caldwell snapped. This petition for conservatorship is denied with extreme prejudice. Furthermore, I am ordering a full transcript of today's proceedings be sent directly to the District Attorney's Office for immediate review regarding multiple counts of perjury and attempted fraud by the petitioners. The judge shifted his blazing gaze to the witness box. Bailiffs, Caldwell ordered. Detain Mr. Kensington. You will hold him in the holding cell downstairs until the federal agents in the hallway are ready to take him into custody. Two heavy-set bailiffs immediately converged on the witness box. They hauled Brad to his feet. He did not fight them. His legs were essentially useless, dragging against the polished floor as they pulled his arms behind his back, the sharp metallic click of handcuffs ringing out clearly in the dead silent room. They marched the ruined financial manager out a side door, discarding him like yesterday's trash. The sheer finality of the judge's ruling hung over the courtroom. The empire of lies my family had built over decades had been completely vaporized in less than an hour. The wealth, the status, the arrogance, all of it was gone, leaving them exposed to the brutal, unforgiving light of justice. I stood in the center of the room, adjusting my blazer, feeling a profound, absolute sense of closure. I turned to walk back to my seat beside Marcus, ready to pack my briefcase and walk out of this courthouse as a free woman. Maya, wait. The voice was shrill, cracking with desperate, raw panic. I stopped and looked back. Vivian was on her feet. The immaculate, untouchable matriarch had vanished. Her expensive mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. Her perfectly styled hair was a mess. She stumbled out from behind the heavy wooden table, tears pouring from her eyes, her hands reaching out toward me, as if she were drowning and I was the only life raft in the ocean. Maya, please. Vivian choked out, her voice breaking as she took a stumbling step toward me. She dropped entirely to her knees right there on the hard courtroom floor, completely abandoning her precious pride in front of the judge, the press, and the stunned gallery. Please. My mother begged, sobbing hysterically, reaching her trembling hands toward my shoes. I am so sorry. We made a mistake. We were scared. Please, Maya, you have to forgive us. You have to save us. Think about our family legacy. I looked down at the woman groveling at my feet. This was the woman who had spent my entire life treating me like a stain on her meticulous social record. Her manicured hands pawed desperately at the hem of my trousers, her expensive perfume soured by the sharp metallic tang of pure panic. Behind her, Chloe was shrieking a high, thin sound of absolute hysteria as the reality of her impending bankruptcy and federal exposure finally took root. I did not reach down to help Vivian up. I did not offer a comforting smile or a reassuring word. I simply looked at her, my face completely devoid of emotion. The pity I might have felt years ago had been surgically removed, burned away by the sheer audacity of their greed. Your legacy is fraud, Mother, I said, my voice cold and echoing clearly across the shocked courtroom. Mine is excellence. I stepped back, forcing her hands to fall away from me. Vivian let out a gut-wrenching wail, collapsing forward until her forehead rested against the cold limestone floor. She was a broken queen ruling over an empire of dust. Chloe scrambled out of her chair, lunging toward our mother, her designer heels slipping on the polished floor. She was screaming my name, screaming at the judge, screaming at the bailiffs who were currently shoving Brad through the side door. The sharp clatter of his handcuffs striking the doorframe was the final punctuation mark on his ruined career. I turned away from the wreckage. I picked up my briefcase from the defense table, giving Marcus a single curt nod of approval. He returned it, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his professional facade. Together we turned and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The gallery, previously packed with hostile spectators and sneering socialites who had come to watch my execution, parted instantly. They pressed themselves against the heavy wooden benches to let me pass. The reporters who had been furiously scribbling notes just minutes before now stared at me with wide, reverent eyes. I was no longer the tragic, mentally unstable sister. I was the apex predator who had just orchestrated the most spectacular financial bloodbath this city had ever seen. Marcus pushed open the heavy oak doors, and we stepped out into the chaotic, echoing hallway of the courthouse. The sound of my mother's wailing was abruptly cut off as the doors swung shut behind us. The moment we crossed the threshold toward the main entrance, the real storm began. Word had already leaked from inside the courtroom. The local press corps had multiplied, joined by national financial correspondents and investigative journalists who had caught wind of the Vanguard Holdings revelation. The massive stone staircase leading down to the street was completely swarmed. "Miss Blackwood," a reporter shouted, shoving a microphone toward my face. "Are you confirming that you are the sole owner of Vanguard Holdings?" "Maya?" Another yelled, flashing bulbs blindingly bright in the overcast afternoon light. "Is it true you intend to liquidate Apex Financial? What are your plans for the Oak Creek estate now that your family is facing eviction?" I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride. My private security detail, a team of 4 massive men in dark suits who had been waiting discreetly in the lobby, immediately formed a tight wedge around me. They moved with absolute precision, carving a clear path down the sprawling concrete steps. The clamor of the press washed over me like static. They were begging for a quote, desperate for a soundbite from the phantom billionaire who had just stepped out of the shadows and decapitated a corrupt financial institution before lunch. I kept my gaze fixed forward, my expression an impenetrable mask of corporate authority. I had nothing to say to them. My actions inside that courtroom had spoken volumes, and the reverberations would echo through the financial sector for months to come. I was not a victim seeking vindication in the media. I was a titan of industry returning to work. At the base of the stairs, idling silently against the curb, sat my waiting armored Maybach. The driver stood at attention, immediately pulling open the heavy bulletproof rear door as my security team held back the surging tide of reporters. I stepped into the cavernous, leather-lined interior of the vehicle. The door slammed shut behind me, instantly silencing the frantic shouting and the aggressive popping of camera flashes. The cabin was a sanctuary of absolute insulated quiet. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound as the car smoothly pulled away from the curb, gliding effortlessly into the city traffic. I settled back into the plush reclining seat, letting out a slow, controlled breath. I reached forward and picked up my encrypted iPad from the center console. The screen woke instantly, displaying a dashboard of real-time global market data. My portfolio was flashing green. I opened a pending transaction file, a multi-million-dollar acquisition of a struggling European tech firm that my analysts had flagged the night before. I reviewed the final terms typed in my authorization code and approved the trade with a single tap of my finger. Beside me, embedded in the console, was a chilled glass of sparkling water. I picked it up, the condensation cool against my palm, and took a slow, refreshing sip. I looked up, catching my reflection in the rearview mirror. Behind the dark-tinted glass of the Maybach, the courthouse was rapidly shrinking into the distance. Inside that building, my mother was sobbing on the floor, my sister was screaming into the void, and Brad was sitting in a holding cell, waiting for the FBI to strip him of his remaining dignity. They had spent their entire lives building a fake empire on a foundation of lies, greed, and cruelty. They had tried to bury me to keep it standing. Now that empire was nothing but ashes. And as my car accelerated onto the highway, carrying me back to the real world I had conquered, I left them and their ashes far behind in the rearview mirror. True strength lies in financial and emotional independence, especially when facing toxic family dynamics. The ultimate lesson is that you cannot buy genuine love or respect. Catering to entitled, manipulative relatives only enables their continued abuse. Real power comes from quietly building your own success, maintaining your integrity, and refusing to be defined by those who belittle you. When forced to confront betrayal, clear boundaries and undeniable facts are your absolute greatest weapons against gaslighting. Never set yourself on fire to keep your abusers warm. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic family members? Share your story below.